Hello everyone, the Grim Dawn class examination. This is episode 2 of the in-depth examination of the Commando. Now we will be talking about the endgame sets available to the Commando, specifically for the Commando, but this is going to surprise you. There's only 5, and I'm going to be really honest, one of those isn't even actually specific to the Commando, it's just really useful for the Commando. We'll talk about that second. I actually want to talk about the two more unusual sets first. The first one being the Beryl Destroyers. Now, this is actually a set specifically for just the Demolitionist. It just dual wields pistols without you necessarily needing to be an Inquisitor or equipping very specific relics. Generally speaking, these don't work particularly well with other sets because it is dual wielding pistols, and most sets include a weapon. These are very much if you haven't got a complete set but you happen to have these, or you really like Canister Bomb and Granado. Do I use these a ton with the Commando? Honestly, no. There's a couple of problems using these two particular weapons with the Commando, and that's primarily in the almost complete lack of any need at all to utilize anything out of Soldier. They do fire and lightning damage, so you would want to use just the first part of Flame Touched and basically leave it alone. You could theoretically use Cadence with Discord for the elemental damage, but Fire Strike is just going to be a lot better for that up to Static Strike. Now, at least in theory that's the case. Personally, when I did use these, because I have used these a couple of times, once out of curiosity and a second time trying to maximize these, because I'm one of those insane kind of people, I did actually find on my second run with those that Cadence with Discord was actually much more useful, primarily because as nice as Fire Strike seems to be at first with fire and physical damage, the problem really is that the fire damage is being converted to lightning damage, and while these guns do in fact boost fire damage, that's not a problem. They're primarily focused on the lightning damage side of things, right? You'll even notice that they convert Canister Bomb to lightning damage without you even needing to go into Concussive Bomb, which saves you 3 whole skill points. But it still comes down to the mild problem that there is, other than Cadence with Discord, and specifically Markovian's Advantage, because it gives plus whatever percent to all damage, which includes elemental damage, there's very little you're going to be pulling out of the Commando. I mean, you can't use Menhir's Will because you're not using a shield or a two-handed melee weapon. You might be running military conditioning, possibly, and there's also a case to be made for Veterancy or Scars of Battle, but that's a lot of points to be investing for Scars of Battle. You would only really want to potentially go here if you're going all the way down to Deadly Momentum. And if you're going down all the way to Deadly Momentum, you would probably want Temper as well. Personally, I just didn't really find a ton of use for the soldier side of things. Again, Cadence with Discord is fine. I did try Fighting Form, but I really didn't find it that useful. I actually mostly just kept Cadence here, used Discord at full, and I ran Military Conditioning and Markovian's Advantage is generally how I ran this. I experimented around with a couple of different skills. You know, I went back and forth on a bunch of things. So this isn't like what I was using 100% of the time, but this is what I ultimately settled in with. Was the Commando with these, and then for Demolitionist, I went into Flame Touched and Granado, of course, which, if I remember correctly, I don't think that these convert that, so I believe I put the point in to make Granado. Yes, I did. I thought so. I converted that to lightning damage. I maxed these. Obviously maxed these. And actually what I did wind up doing, and this is not something I do very often, but what I found very useful, considering how few points I put into soldier, I actually went into Ulzwin's Chosen because I already had Granado, I already had Canister Bomb, I was already focusing on lightning damage in the first place, so Stunjacks was a natural choice. So this is actually, interestingly enough, one of the few times I busted out Ulzwin's Wrath that I actually took the time to put all those points in specifically for Ulzwin's Wrath. Now, at this point, this is generally where I started fluctuating around with what I actually built. I spent a little bit of time with Temper, just to see how that went. I spent a little time with Vindictive Flame and Ulzwin's Wrath. I spent some time with Blackwater Cocktail. That really didn't work out. Spoiler. What I did eventually wind up mostly doing was just popping up over here and just boosting my damage with this, and then putting the rest of the points in Temper. Actually, I think I maxed Temper and put 1 point less in this. It was what I ultimately wound up sticking with. But if you wanted to go all the way with Cadence and just max Fighting Form and Deadly Momentum, you absolutely can. But that's just ultimately where I went with the salvo, the Barrels of Smith's Destroyers. The only real problem, I mean, yes, this is somewhat effective, and it's mostly, again, geared around the concept of Demolitionist. This was very effective. It was weird because while on the one hand you want to be using Cadence in your auto attacks, on the other hand, spamming a lot of these grenades and the Stunjacks was also highly effective. So it really came down to, well, am I going against a group and throwing explosives, or am I going against a single target and blasting them from a distance? Right, and that's basically what it comes down to in terms of decision-making. Do I want to... I mean, am I against a group, or am I against an individual target? Fairly, actually, surprisingly useful in the Shattered Realm, because you have, of course, the knockback from the Granado. You've got the stun from the Stunjacks, obviously, and you have answers to the group enemies for the regular floors, and you've got, of course, your regular attacks for the bosses on the, every 4 floors, and Stunjacks as well. And if you're up against multiple bosses, you just chuck explosives until one of them dies. Ulzwin's Chosen is fairly interesting in that it kind of allows that to happen. What are we doing here? We having a problem? Oh, that's right. I keep forgetting it requires one of these. Right, you actually have a decent chance of just being able to spam those just constantly. So, and it's not like their recharge is supremely long, 3 seconds here, and that's not even including the drops in their cooldowns from the Barrelsmith Salvo, but 3 seconds here. I think this is 4.5, I was going to say 4. And this is, of course, 3 seconds, and then these actually reduce that. Canister Bomb down by 1.3, and Granado by 0.8. So you've got just this absolutely en masse chucking of grenades. The extended radius of Granado isn't too big of a deal, honestly. It just allows you to wipe out more enemies in a group. But really, how effective these are really depends on how lucky you are in getting green drops, really. Or you just want to equip one of the... There are a couple of armor sets that don't have any weapons that are generic to all classes. I don't talk about those here specifically because they are generic to all classes. I will eventually do a video on those, but there are a couple of armor sets that you can use with these. But for the most part, I think a lot of players are going to take these and just use them with whatever other armor that they've currently just got on hand at the time. And that's going to drastically alter whether or not you're going to do well with these. And for an improv player, it's more interesting, but at this point, we're talking about endgame, so constructing a little bit more of a cohesive build is something you're going to be wanting at that point anyways, so it is a bit tough to use these, but again, it depends kind of on how lucky you are, and how into dual-wielding pistols you are. It is, very interesting to play the build. I did like it more the second time around when I had a better understanding of what I was doing with these two. I had to, I went into it with a clearer picture of what I wanted to do with them, and where I was going to take them. Whereas the first time I used these, I was winging it and had no idea what I was going to do with them. But not bad, but it is a little bit restrictive in terms of the soldier side, really, and what you can use there. Then we have the Stronghold of the Legion. Now, I mentioned this before with the Oathkeeper, the Paladin, and it's the same kind of thing here. We're just talking about a shield with a single pistol and fire damage. Again, that kind of goes into the Demolitionist. Now, the interesting thing here is that you've pretty much got free reign to build however you want. They don't increase any particular skills. This is +2 to all skills. What I do tend to run is Force Wave, obviously, because you do want that ranged stun for your glorious, blasting enemies from a distance. Whether or not you choose to use Cadence or Fire Strike is totally up to you. I personally have a mild preference for Fire Strike in this situation, using the Stronghold of the Legion, but that's, again, more of my personal preference. If you're happier with Cadence, absolutely use that. Beyond that, it's free game for how you want to build. Like I said, I do recommend Force Wave for the long-range stun. I do recommend a little bit Fire Strike, but Cadence at the very least. But yeah, there's very little I can say about this, because it really is almost 100% up to you how you want to build for this. And that's totally fine. But it is worth mentioning that this is another one of the very few classes that I actually use Stronghold of the Legion for. I'm kind of specific about this one because it does do fire damage and it does have a shield, so I tend to use it with Oathkeeper, but this is one of the few soldier classes that I'll really go out of my way and play with this. Then we have... Okay. I'll have to come back to that. So we'll talk about Velden's Betrayal, which is the only endgame armor set that is very specifically geared towards the Commandos specifically. Now, it is interesting in that this is two-handed. This is actually a really good thing, because the actual set itself, in terms of Commando, is looking to do piercing damage using Cadence and Temper. Now, there's a fairly interesting thing here, in that you'll notice 100% of fire damage is converted to piercing damage with Cadence. That is just basically saying any fire damage enhancement that you do have is being converted to piercing damage. Now, there's not a whole lot there. Say you've got let's just take an example. A constellation, I can't remember any constellations off the top of my head that do this. A constellation that gives you just flat fire damage. That would be converted to piercing damage for all intents and purposes. But in this particular instance, you want to just maximize fighting form, go into deadly momentum. That's all increasing your piercing damage. You are going to be wanting to go into Olrin's Rage, again, for that piercing damage. This increases not piercing damage. I can never remember that. For Demolitionist, Flame Touched is nice and all, but what you're really here for is Temper. And then you'll also notice, yes, ranged expertise, there is the option to use this with Inquisitor as well, but that doesn't matter. You'll notice that we have a nice activates off default weapon attacks, so that's even more just random damage out of Cadence. Delightful amount of piercing damage here. You've got Cadence, of course, you've got Brimstone, which I believe is, yeah, this. Now, that is fairly interesting, and I never used Brimstone with this, which is actually why I forgot this, but it does technically offer you the option of either Cadence or Fire Strike, but that's really more designed to be used with specifically the Inquisitor Demolitionist combination, because you can use Fire Strike without any kind of competition when you're a Demolitionist Inquisitor rather than the Soldier, which has the competition of Cadence. But I don't personally ever use Brimstone with this set, even in a Demolitionist Inquisitor setting, because in terms of increasing pierce damage, Brimstone is fairly nonsense, because Brimstone does not... I mean, yes, it does chaos damage, it does fire damage, which is converted to pierce damage, but that's a lot of points to be putting in just to grab some pierce damage. I mean, 60... It's not even 60 pierce damage. I think it only converts a percentage, doesn't it? 50%, yeah, half. So 30 extra pierce damage, and you're really not trying to focus on fire damage too much. So it just doesn't, it's never made sense to me to go all the way to Brimstone. So I don't. I'll sometimes stop at Static Strike, but I'm wandering off tangent. I'm wandering off subject a little bit too much here. So let's refocus here. And, yep, we have Deadly Momentum, Flame Touched, of course. +2 to all skills. So much fire damage converted to piercing damage is so much, you know, good old fire damage. Now, more to the point, you do have just this activatable ability. You've got defense here. It's just, yeah, basically down to the pierce damage. You bust out Deadly Momentum, you bust out Olorin's Rage. Where you want to go from here, totally up to you. Flame Touched, obviously. Temper, those are both being boosted. But from here, it's pretty free game. Typically, I'll focus on Soldier. I mean, you are wielding a two-handed... I'm sorry, it's a two-handed melee weapon. I don't know why I thought it could be used there. Typically, I will go into Military Conditioning. Again, I am fond of Markovian's Advantage. From here, where you want to go with it is totally up to you. You've got all kinds of options, but obviously, at minimum, you're going through Cadence and Olorin's Rage and Military Conditioning, obviously Temper. I'll go more into a more specific build with this in the final episode. I'm just trying to overview the sets right now and what I generally do. I'm still looking at this from an improv perspective. And then we have Markovian's Bastion, which is fairly interesting from the perspective of the Commando, because this is a melee shield build. So for Demolitionist, you have actually a couple of different options. But in this particular instance, because this is mostly focused on, you'll notice, physical internal trauma, not so much the pierce, what I actually tend to do with this is not use Cadence. Alright? I really don't. What I tend to do is run Markovian's Advantage, obviously. What exclusive skill you use is up to you, depends on how defensive you want to be. Still leaning on Temper, but I tend to use Fire Strike, and the reason why I tend to use Fire Strike with Explosive Strike is because I can use Searing Strike and make my abilities cheaper, and still do a little bit more damage with my regular attacks, which is not something Cadence offers. Yes, Cadence is powerful and all that. Yippee-ki-yay. But these, you know, you get this wonderful benefit here. If you really want to, you have access to stun jacks, which I typically tend to build here because they are one of the more effective stuns, especially at the melee range, and since you're already in melee range. And again, it is worth noting that this is increasing physical damage. You're still doing physical damage with Fire Strike, right? You're still doing physical damage and internal trauma damage with full spread. It's just that you're splashing in a little bit of elemental. And again, I emphasize this every time. Splashing a little bit of some other damage type outside of your primary is so easy in this game. To not do so is to leave yourself very weak to enemies resistant to your primary damage type. Typically, I will also actually go into Vindictive Flame. There are a couple of reasons for this, and all the way to Olorin's Wrath as well. First off, while the elemental damage is nice, it's not actually why you want this here. You generally want this for the retaliation to distant enemies, the ranged enemies, as well as increasing your speed in general, which includes the amount of times you're whacking people with Fire Strike. But even if you prefer Cadence, if you want to use Cadence over Fire Strike, which you absolutely can do, it's just a matter of personal preference. Vindictive Flame's increased total speed helps that a lot because it's every third attack, and with increased attack speed you get third attacks more often. Right? You get, you know, Menhir's Bulwark. That is this, right? Yeah. Now, even though the set increases Menhir's Bulwark, and it does happen to be very effective, you don't necessarily need to. You can go into Olorin's Rage. I have before. I tend to use Menhir's Bulwark with this. Obviously, Blitz. Right. Whether or not you actually feel like using Blitz is up to you. I typically tend to because it is a lot of fun to play. It is very effective. and this is actually part of the reason why you don't maximize the Demolitionist, because you actually pull these points out and you generally will put them into Blitz and whatever other stats you feel like going into. Typically, I'll put the last 3 points, or however many leftover points I have, depending on how I'm building, into military conditioning, generally. Now, you don't necessarily have to go into Temper. I happen to, because I find it pretty effective. Again, that's a matter of personal choice. You could absolutely instead put them into Field Command if you really wanted to, or you could finish off military conditioning, and maybe you could grab Decorated Soldier if you really wanted to. That's also an option, and in some ways, actually, it's probably a more effective one. I tend, again, because it's so easy splashing in elemental damage, I prefer Flame Touched as a personal preference. But if you're really looking to stretch those points out, you take those out, you put them in the Decorated Soldier, you finish off military conditioning, and then maybe you grab, I don't know. Maybe you grab Veterancy, right? You know, just put that in there for the health regen. Totally up to you. But there is that as well. And now we have to go for the Ulzuin, because I accidentally deleted it. This might take forever. Here we go. Is that the level 94 version? No. Where is that? That was probably... Here we go. And then we have the Ulzuin's set. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this, because I'm just not a fan of this set, personally, because it increases Canister Bomb, and it does all this for Canister Bomb, and then you kind of have to make this tough personal choice. Do I want to continue on utilizing, you know, the Canister Bomb? Do I just want to spam these, or instead am I going to blast people across the room with my regular attacks? And we get +2 to Ulzuin's Chosen, but I don't necessarily always build Ulzuin's Chosen with this set. And again, the primary reason why is because I'm not necessarily always sure that I want to. And again, this is another one that I have a mild preference for Cadence on, but there is, again, nothing wrong with Fire Strike because you have access to Searing Might here. It all comes down to how your personal preferences run. Maybe you're a bigger fan of Cadence, go for Cadence. If you're a bigger fan of Fire Strike, go for Fire Strike. I mean, it doesn't make a huge difference which one in terms of... Well, I can't say it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of damage output, because it really depends on how many attacks you're talking about when you're calculating that. But anyways, but it's mostly down to personal preference. They're both pretty effective. They're both about as equally effective for this set. You're usually going to bust out a Canister Bomb, obviously, because it's just improved all across the board here. Whether or not you decide to go fully into Ulzuin's Chosen, or you decide to develop any of the other grenade weapons, I guess I would call them, that's totally up to you. And whether or not, again, you use Cadence or Fire Strike, that is up to you. Again, I almost always bust out Markovian's Advantage here, because not using that is practically a crime against yourself, for really selling your two-handed ranged weapon auto attacks short. But yeah, it's a weird build because it improves this one projectile. There's the increased Vindictive Flame, but that's not necessarily as important either. The Blast Shield is actually really nice. The Blast Shield boost, I totally forgot about that for a second there. This is pretty nice. Not entirely something you're going to like rely on. At 12% health restored is nice and all, but that's more of a boost, a freebie, than something you can rely on. But yeah, you kind of are being... It's kind of up in the air whether you want to use full grenades with Ulzuin's Chosen or not. I've tried it with Ulzuin's Chosen. I didn't like it, so I played it again without, and I preferred a little that way. Again, I prefer to use Cadence here. And again, once again, I really didn't push far into the soldier side of Commando. I just went this far. I got, you know, Canister Bomb, I got Blast Shield, I got Temper. I'm sorry, not Temper. Flame Touch, I didn't get Temper. and I do believe I did go into Vindictive Flame at the time, but it just has this really awkward aspect to it for me personally, where it's trying to it's encouraging you to use this specific combination of skills, but a lot of the skills I just don't tend to use in Commando anyways. But yeah, that is the end game sets for Commando. So if you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.